Hello, and thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about how to set up zero-touch provisioning for your environment. So first off, what is zero-touch provisioning? So zero-touch provisioning is when a user sets up a computer themselves without any IT interaction. The popular Jamf phrase that they like to give is step 1 is to open the box, step 2 is to power on your MacBook, and then step 3, there is no step 3. But how do we actually get there? Before we even get started on that, I want to show you a video of what this looks like. You've probably seen this in demos and things like that. But it's where a user opens up the computer for the first time, turns it on, and then goes through the setup assistant. They connect to Wi-Fi. Once they're connected, they see this remote management screen. They may log in with their username and password from AD. Then their user account is created automatically. They log in again to get to the home screen. And then they'll see this typical provisioning window where it will bring them through the installation of all the different components that they need in order to do their job. So in a basic sense, that's what it looks like. But how does it work and how do we get there? And I'll say this, a lot of times I think people, as they're kind of getting introduced to Jamf and MDM and all this stuff for the first time, they kind of think that zero-touch provisioning just happens. They think that once they purchase Jamf, you have zero-touch. But that's like saying that if you bought a bunch of lumber and some nails and a hammer, that you have a house. Like, it's a great first step in order to get there, but you really just started on that project. So when we're talking about zero-touch, this is really an intersection between three different things: user experience, security, and then the simplicity of the workflow. And this is taking all those components together and making sure we can make something that intersects in the middle called zero-touch. And this is really an all or nothing thing. If you're 99% of the way there, you're not going to be able to drop ship a computer to a user and be assured that it's going to be set up exactly how they need it to be on day one. So you need to make sure that you can get all those different teams working together to say, hey, how can we get a workflow that's going to work for our users? So with this will take a word that probably a lot of people hate. It's going to take some compromises. For instance, with the user experience, if you want zero-touch to be part of your workflow, you need to have the users logging into all their different pieces of software. You can't automate that portion of it. On the security side, we're going to need to make sure that the users are able to set up their computers remotely, and we have workflows in place that aren't going to require IT to interact with it ahead of time. So this takes a lot of work and a lot of discussion before we even get started. So let's dive into what this process looks like. So at the beginning of this process, we like to ask a lot of questions about a customer's environment. Once we've asked those questions, we then create a list to show all the things that the user needs on day one. We then look at that list and address any challenges that exist in that list. Like, what are going to be the hardest things to automate in that list? And then lastly, we set up the provisioning workflow through Jamf Pro. Now, a lot of people look at this and they go to the last step first and they say, hey, I want to set up zero-touch provisioning. What do I need to start doing in Jamf? And that's not really the first place to look. There's a lot of work before that to see what that workflow even looks like. So let's dive in and see what this looks like from asking questions. So these are questions we typically ask people when they're setting up zero-touch provisioning for the first time. So first off, do you have an identity provider like Okta, Azure AD, or any of the other popular ones? Do you have a local AD server that you're connecting to? And do you have different apps and configs that you need for different users? Or is everyone kind of getting the same config? Next is, what do the users need? So do you have a VPN that users are connecting to when they're working remotely? Do you need users to connect to your office Wi-Fi? If so, how are they currently connecting? Is this a WPA2 network or a WPA3 enterprise network? Do you need certificates? Do you need to connect to a Cisco ISE server or another type of complex server? What security requirements do you have? That's a really big one. Oftentimes we need to work with the security team to talk through that. And sometimes we need to say, hey, some of these security requirements that you have for your Windows computers are awesome, but they just don't apply to the Macs. And if we try to do them, we're going to create huge problems for the users. And then what applications do your users need on day one? And that kind of is a good segue for the next part, which is that first day experience. So that's looking at how do you want the first day of the users with their new computers to be? Are they coming into the office to receive that Mac? Are those being sent directly to their home and they're getting into a Zoom meeting for some type of orientation? Is there any type of, official orientation that they're going to go through? Or are they kind of on their own and kind of getting things set up? Is there an external set of instructions that you want users to follow? Or do you want all the instructions to be on screen? And are you 100% sure that all your computers are in DEP? And that's really important. And I'll say DEP and automated enrollment. DEP is a term we don't really use anymore. It's called automated enrollment now. But for zero-touch provisioning to work, we really do need automated enrollment in place in order for that to work. And sometimes when you're working with third-party resellers and stuff like that, it can be difficult to get those computers into DEP right when you order them. All right, now that you've asked a bunch of questions, you need to create a list of everything that you need. So now I'm going to start talking about this specific example. So this is an example that we set up for one of our clients. So they specifically needed Crowdstrike for a security requirement, McAfee web proxy, NoMAD for password synchronization with AD. Specifically at the time that we set this up, they needed NoMAD because Jamf Connect didn't work with ADFS, which is no longer the case, but that's what we set up at the time. They also need FileVault Encryption and a Screensaver lock. And then as far as applications and configurations for users, we needed Cisco AnyConnect to connect to their local VPN, printers, Microsoft Office, a Wi-Fi profile to connect to their local network, and then a host of internal certificates to connect to different internal resources. Once we make that list, then it's time to address the challenges. So when we start looking at different challenges that people might have, a lot of these have to do with integrations. And the reason I put that as a challenge is oftentimes I only have access to the Jamf server, or we might only have access to the Jamf server, but we might not have access to all these other different services that we use. So that includes single sign-on and cloud identity providers. LDAP server integration can be a big challenge. Typically that's a local AD server. And getting that connected to Jamf Cloud specifically, we're going to need Infrastructure Manager in order to get that working. So that's another server we'll need to set up in the DMZ and probably need to work with some other teams. Apple Business Manager, if you don't have that set up and you've set that up before, you know that that's a bit of a process to get set up. Conditional access with InTune, an ADCS connector, that's going to be another server that you need to set up, and then Cisco ISE Integration. Another challenge that people typically face is automatically grouping your devices. So if you imagine drop shipping a computer to a user and having them set up that computer themselves, you're going to need to make sure that they're in the right group so that they get the right software. And they're going to need to do that without you manually going into Jamf and sorting it into the right group. Otherwise, there's going to be a delay and you're going to have to interact with it each time. So we want to make sure that this workflow is completely automated so that you could be on vacation somewhere and someone could get a new computer without you even knowing it, and they would be good to go without anyone from IT interacting with this process. So how can we group computers? One is an identity provider. The next is LDAP integration. both of those, you can kind of either, so with the identity provider, there's two cloud-hosted ways to be able to sort computers similar to LDAP. One is Google, and one is with Azure AD. If you have either of those integrations, then you can sort them by like building and department or any other attribute you can get from those resources. LDAP works exactly the same. You're going to sort them by the different attributes that they have. Typically, we use the building and department attribute. If you don't have either of those, or if both of those servers aren't really organized that well, there's always the user choice option. So that's where we have the user select which department they're in, and then they'll get software based on that. That's not always the greatest choice if we're doing zero touch, because obviously that's prone to error. The user could select the wrong department, and then we kind of got to go backwards from there. There's also unique custom solutions we can always think about. One example of this is if you get, I've seen companies where their sales team always gets MacBook Airs and their engineering team gets MacBook Pros. And as long as that's always the same, we can use that information to create a smart group to create two different groups. I'll say here too, another great option is to have one base setup that you have for everyone, and then that's your group. You don't have any specific groups with different applications. You let each team kind of manage their own applications. This works pretty well in a large enterprise environment where you may have a lot of different departments with a lot of different needs. And instead of IT trying to control all that, you just allow the different teams to control the software that they need. And the last is automating each component. And this is the stuff we love to do in Jamf Pro. This is the scripting, the packaging, the policies, the configuration profiles, the smart groups, using the API, using multiple different APIs to make complex workflows happen. And we'll dive into some of those challenges that we've addressed later. So now that we've gone through that, I'd like to come back to this list we had initially. So we talked about that before, and at this step, I like to make a challenges list. So I look through everything that we had before, and I say, what's going to be difficult? So with this particular example, we're looking at connecting to the internal network. This is probably our number one challenge, because first of all, we needed a machine certificate, so we needed to set up an ADCS connector. That's always fun, especially in large enterprises where you've got a bunch of different people working to connect the firewalls and stuff like that. People needing to request permission in order to get that ADCS connector working. And to explain how this works, the ADCS connector sits in the same domain as your certificate authority. It's in the same, so that server is able to connect directly to your certificate authority in order to grant certificates. So it can create a machine or a user certificate. Then connects also directly to Jamf, which is hosted in the cloud, so it can distribute that certificate, and then Jamf is able to distribute it to the computer directly. And that will work even if the computer is remote. And then the next thing we needed is the Cisco ISE integration. So this was another, I actually did a presentation on this a couple years ago at JNUC. The reason this was a huge challenge is because their Cisco ISE server had multiple MDMs. And we had to kind of show the Cisco ISE server which MDM to connect each computer to for the MDM compliance piece of Cisco ISE. All right, next we have LDAP integration, which we needed an internal CA and to set up Jamf Infrastructure Manager. That's another separate server that's being set up in the DMZ that can talk to Jamf Cloud and the local AD server. And then some other challenges we had in terms of packaging, with just the McAfee web proxy and Cisco AnyConnect. These weren't huge challenges, but they're worth noting because they are very complex installs. They both require an install script, multiple packages, and different certificates and configurations. So once we address these challenges, we are finally ready to start the provisioning workflow. I've already gotten almost 15 minutes into this presentation before I've even talked about anything with this provisioning workflow. So this is definitely not the place you start. it's probably 2/3 of the way through this process of getting zero touch working. And at the beginning of this, we start asking a lot of questions again. So what order does everything need to run in? Does it require any user interaction during the process? So for instance, for our process, McAfee needed to be connected to the local network in order to install. So if this was going to work remotely, we had to ensure that the users connected to Cisco AnyConnect before McAfee started installing. Is there anything that might be confusing for the users? If there is, we may want to add some instructions into our provisioning workflow so that they aren't too confused. Are there any points of failure? If there are, we probably want to account for those and have a plan B and even a plan C just in case any problems happen. The hard part with zero-touch provisioning is if a problem does happen, well, now we got to work with the user remotely, and they don't even have a set-up computer that we can screen share with. So we're like on a phone call with them trying to see which step they're on. So we want to make sure we're logging everything as much as we can so we know what step they're on and that we're able to account for anything that might possibly go wrong in our testing. Which brings us to the next step. Test, 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 and then test some more. I think I said too many tests, but that's fine. It's better to over-test than under-test. This is one of the big things we do as well, is we test a lot. We test each of the OS releases that come out. We test the provisioning workflow multiple times. We even try to break it as much as possible. So try to think as you're going through that testing, like what could the user break? What happens if they just restart their computer in the middle of this provisioning process? Is that going to break everything, or will it eventually fix itself? And then there's a lot of additional tools that we like to use, and then additional pro tips that a lot of people don't know about. First tool, one of the biggest one we use, is DEPNotify. There's a lot of other solutions like SplashBuddy or Octary out there. We've kind of tested each of them, and we really like the customability of DEPNotify the best. And I think it's been just the most consistent that we've seen throughout the years. DEPNotify, if you don't know, is that provisioning window that I showed you before at the beginning of this presentation that brings the user through the provisioning process. Organize policies by the order they're running. This is one of those lesser known things within Jamf Pro, but if you have a bunch of policies, it will run and it's all hitting one trigger at the same time. For instance, a recurring check-in or enrollment complete trigger. If you have them running, or if you have them categorized in a certain alphabetical order, they will run in that order. So I like to use a numeric naming convention for my policies so that I know which order they're running. And then again, pilot, improve, and test with each macOS version. Cool. And now we get to the exciting part of this presentation. We're going to dive into the Jamf server and demo what this looks like. Of course, I don't have that up, so just a second. So this is our test server within Jamf Pro. We're going to start in the system settings over here. So first off, for being able to sort the computers and assign it to the right user, we set up LDAP integration with our local AD server, which also required setting up the Jamf Infrastructure Manager. Next, we set up DEP through automated device enrollment in order to ensure that the devices are automatically enrolled. Absolutely essential if you're going to do zero touch. Here we set up the PKI certificate in order to set up the ADCS connector. So in order to do this, like I said before, we had to set up a server in their internal network that connect to their certificate authority so it could dish out that certificate to the Jamf Pro server. And then we had to upload the certificates into the Jamf portal for this to work. We also set up network integration with Cisco ISE. Most of this setup is done on the Cisco ISE side, and like I said before, we set up a complex workflow to utilize both Jamf and Cisco ISE's APIs to make sure Cisco ISE knows which server to send the computers to for MDM compliance. Cool, and once we got those back-end stuff set up, we started to go into the pre-stage. So I like to show the pre-stage first because this is the first thing that the computers are going to be going through when they're getting set up. And this just started happening this morning, so I'll have to look into that. Hopefully that's not a global error that's happening, and it's just happening in our test server. But I'm going to edit this so you can see how we kind of set up this provisioning workflow. So first off, I'm a really big component that even if you have multiple groups of computers that you're using within Jamf Pro and they need to get sorted into those groups, that you only use one pre-stage. This just ensures that you don't have to be manually moving computers back and forward between pre-stages. That can be very cumbersome. It also kind of makes you have to be on all the time when you're purchasing computers. I like an automated workflow where I really don't have to think about it too much. It just kind of happens. So for this example, I only have one pre-stage. I'm automatically assigning new devices so that as they come in, I don't have to keep assigning them to the new pre-stage. I'm requiring authentication, and this is requiring authentication with LDAP, and then giving a message to log in with their email and password, making the MDM profile mandatory, preventing user from enabling activation lock. And then I'm skipping most of the setup assistance steps. The only ones I'm keeping is location services and then transferring information. So location services, the user needs to turn on manually, and transferring information is important if the user is moving from one Mac to another, because it's a great way to get information between the two, especially if you're restricting external drives. Next, we're going to go to account settings. So in this, I am pre-filling the primary account information with the device owner's details and locking that information. That will create the account automatically using the LDAP authentication we created before. So I prefer this method instead of using NoMAD login or Jamf Connect login because it's a lot quicker and easier for the users. And I've also seen that it just has less chance of failure because it's all happening through MDM instead of relying on a package to get installed or even a configuration profile. So this is the way I like to do it, and I'll show you how kind of smooth that runs. Another thing that may seem weird is I'm not using a enrollment customization. And the reason I don't like to do that is because enrollment customizations will still require the user to set up a user account instead of if you do requiring authentication with LDAP, it will automatically create that, so it saves another step. So once we have the pre-stage set up, we're going to jump into the policies. So as I said before, if a bunch of policies are running at the same time on the same trigger, it'll run in alphabetical order, which is why it's super important to have a naming convention for your policies. This also just visually helps us see when things are happening. So I have all these different policies here. I have the onboarding one, which is running the DEPNotify script and package as an enrollment trigger, and that's the only one being run by the enrollment trigger, and that's going to dictate the rest of the provisioning workflow. I'll show you how that looks in a second. For the rest of these policies, I'm doing once per computer, and then I have a custom trigger. I'm also using recurring check-in as another trigger. So the reason I'm doing that might seem a little bit redundant, but you may have noticed if you've worked in Jamf Pro for a while that this enrollment trigger doesn't always hit when you're using DEP. It's not all the time, but I'd say once out of every 20 times, this seems to fail. So if that happens, we want to make sure that the users are still getting everything they need. So in that case, it'll still start running all this other stuff afterwards. So that's just kind of a plan B in case this enrollment complete trigger doesn't hit. But yeah, so there's an order that we need to run these in. So first off, Crowdstrike needs to install after the onboarding policy. But before everything else, because it's a requirement for Cisco AnyConnect. Then Cisco AnyConnect installs. That's a requirement for McAfee to install and to be able to log into NoMAD. Then we install the rest of the stuff, and we install McAfee last because we want to make sure that they're connected to VPN first through Cisco AnyConnect. So let's dive into each of these policies, hopefully quickly. So the onboarding policy, we're installing the DEPNotify package, some enrollment videos, and then also our company branding. And then we're running the script DEPNotify. I'll show you what that looks like. So if I go inside of here, go to scripts, and onboarding with DEPNotify. So this is the script that's on our GitHub page. I used this base script and then added some customizations to it. First off, if I go into this, we are utilizing parameters. So there's some parameters that are being set here just to look at the initial branding of it. And Chad set up this script as a bunch of functions. So there's a lot of functions here that you can set. I'm not using all of them, but then we set these functions here later on in the script. Some of these things that are really important. Coffee is keeping the computer awake. Pause Jamf framework is making sure that Jamf doesn't keep running additional policies. That would be bad because we have a bunch of policies running as check-in as well. So we want to stop that process. Wait for user. That's another important one. We want to make sure that DEPNotify doesn't run until the user logs in. Otherwise, it won't run properly until that user profile is created. And then start DEPNotify. Once we get into here, we have a couple things that are running. First off, we're going to install Crowdstrike. So we're using, I'll go back to here. You can see the custom event triggers that we're utilizing. If policies loads. Of course, live demos are always fun. Oh no. All right, so you'll see that all of these have custom triggers that we can call at a certain time. Oh man, it's just not running properly. But basically what we're doing is we're first off setting a determinant, which is the progress bar that you're going to see. And then we're going to set the custom triggers to run at different times. So first off, we have Crowdstrike running. Geez, I had saved this before with some different configurations. But basically, it's running Crowdstrike first, and then Cisco AnyConnect. And then it's going to run NoMAD after that, and then Microsoft Office, and then it will clean things up and then configure the dock afterwards. So we're able to control what order things are happening in. And the progress bar is going to move forward each time, and we're also going to change some of the text each time that is happening. I'll have to go through this pretty quickly, otherwise this is a whole nother presentation in itself. But once that base configuration happens, then we kind of reset the window altogether. We play a video that shows the user how to connect to VPN. And then we have a while loop that runs. And it looks to see if it can connect to a local resource. And until it can, it's going to keep running that video. Once it's able to connect to the local resource, which means they've connected to VPN, then it will move on to the next step, which is installing McAfee. And then it'll show another window of it installing McAfee. And then after that, it'll go to another video of showing the user how to log into NoMAD. So it'll bring a video up, say, here's the steps for logging into NoMAD, and then we'll wait for them to log into NoMAD. So what I'm doing is a defaults read to see if this current key in this in the NoMAD P list is set, and if it is, then we will move forward in the process, but it's going to wait until that happens. Once that's done, the enrollment process will complete and it will close out a DEPNotify. So that was a lot, but that was the most complex part that we need to talk about. The rest of them is installing Crowdstrike. We simply install a package and then run a command to license it. For Cisco AnyConnect, we're doing a couple different things. We're first off running a script that creates the XML file to install the choices that we need to. Then we cache the Cisco AnyConnect package. We install their preferences that they need for Cisco AnyConnect, and then we run a post-install script. And that's going to use this cache package and this choices XML to install just the components we need in Cisco AnyConnect. If we didn't do that, it would install everything for Cisco AnyConnect instead of just the secure mobility client, which is the only application we actually need. Then we will install NoMAD, Microsoft Office, printers, self-service icon. And then you'll notice that McAfee does not have a recurring trigger because we really don't want McAfee to install unless it's on the local network, because it needs to pull down the policy for the local resources. And it creates big problems if it doesn't do that. In some of the worst cases, we saw that users were just not able to access the internet, which is a huge problem when we're trying to manage things remotely. So McAfee is really just a couple packages, but like I said, we want to make sure that they're on the internal network before they install it. So we also have a policy in self-service to install McAfee if it's on the external network. So this basically looks like the McAfee install, but it just runs a script like you saw before, where it's testing to see if it's on the local network and then running this custom trigger. All right, well, that's the policies that we'll need in order to install our zero-touch provisioning workflow. But none of these are going to work if we don't have our configuration profiles in place. So let's take a look at those quick. Some of the main things we need is the system extensions for the applications that we're using that are requiring it. So that's going to be Cisco AnyConnect, McAfee, and Crowdstrike. And Crowdstrike, we call it Falcon Profile. That's the one that they provided to us. So some of these we created manually. Some of these were given to us by the vendor. We also needed a content filter for some of those. So for instance, if I go into the Falcon Profile, you'll see that there's a content filter here that we added through this. We also have our security profiles for enabling FileVault, restricting external storage. And then the one thing I do want to go into a bit more here is the Rocketman Wi-Fi. So this is to connect to the internal Wi-Fi network. So first off, I'm going to edit this just so you can see it a little bit more. We have the certificate, and this is the ADCS connector that I was talking about before. We're using $ serial name as the certificate subject. That means that the subject will be their serial number, because this is going to pull it from the computer's serial number. This is a parameter that you can use for any configuration profile, and you can use a lot of different ones. This is just one of them. So that's how we set up that machine certificate, and we also have the Rocketman root certificate that they'll need as well in order for the machine certificate to be trusted. And then we set up the network configuration here. We're using WPA2 Enterprise. We show the accepted EAP types, and then we make sure that this network is using this root certificate as well, and then the ADCS connector for the identity certificate. One thing I'll note too, because I didn't mention this before, all of our policies as another safeguard it's excluding a smart group that says is this application already installed? And you can see that here we have all the different smart groups for has Cisco AnyConnect, which is just looking to see if the application title is Cisco AnyConnect. If it is, if it finds that application on the computer, it won't install that application. This is a good safeguard in place for if people are enrolling a computer that's already set up, or maybe unenrolling and re-enrolling a computer for troubleshooting purposes. We don't want it to have to reinstall all those softwares. And a lot of those packages will actually create problems if they're ran twice. All right, that's a lot of stuff, and it's probably a lot hard to take in. So let's look at what it looks like for the user now that we have this workflow set up. So this is going to look the same at the beginning. The user is going to connect their computer to the internet through the setup assistant. Once they do that, they're going to get that prompt to enable remote management. Once they do that, they'll be prompted for their email and their password. And this is authenticating with the local AD server. Once authenticated, it will go through the 2 prompts, which we didn't skip from before. So they're first it's going to ask them if they want to migrate their data from another computer, and then it's going to ask them for their time zone. So in this case, I'm not going to do that. And then select your time zone. I'm in Denver. And then at this point, that user account is created automatically from when they entered their AD credentials. They're going to log in, and that provisioning window will pop up. And it's going to bring them through installing Crowdstrike, Cisco AnyConnect, NoMAD, and Microsoft Office. And this whole process takes probably 10 to 15 minutes. I'm obviously speeding up a lot for this presentation. And then the user is going to connect to VPN. So this is where I have that video running in the middle here showing the user how to connect to VPN. In this case, it's very simple because they're automatically selecting their region and just clicking connect. They can't actually even change that region. But we still wanted a video to show them what to do. We're also launching the Cisco AnyConnect app. This is all being done through that DEPNotify script that I showed you before. Once they connect to VPN, it will move on to the rest of the process, and it will start installing McAfee. Once McAfee is installed, it will move on to logging into NoMAD. So it has another video showing them how to do that. Once they sign into NoMAD, it will recognize that it's been signed into NoMAD, and it will complete the provisioning process. So that's what the process looks like. This works great for our users, and it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete, depending on how fast their network is. I guess for some people in the mountains that have like satellite internet, it can take like more like an hour to download all the packages. All right, that looks awesome. We have this great provisioning workflow, but we need to look past the automation and what's next. Because sometimes you get this great automated workflow in place, there's a lot more stuff that needs to be done to maintain those workflows. So first off, Macs don't appear out of nowhere. I touched on this at the beginning, but the purchasing process for your Macs is of utmost importance. You should make sure that you're purchasing all your Macs either directly through Apple or through an authorized third-party reseller. And even if you are going through an authorized third-party reseller, you're going to need to work with them to make sure the devices are automatically going into DEP. I've seen it all the time with CDW, SHI, Verizon, and any other third-party reseller I've worked with. They all have issues putting them into your DEP account automatically. So you need to work with them through that process. Next is, how is the laptop being sent to the users? Are you drop shipping them to them? Are they going to the office first and then someone's sending them out? And what's your offboarding process? You need to make sure you have that in place, or if someone's doing a refresh, what does that look like? These are processes that don't always really have to do with us a whole lot, but it's important to make sure that our Jamf workflow is successful. And super important to not forget about the user. I did a presentation on this year, but we need to make sure that we have user instructions. We need to make sure we have orientation. And apart from us doing tier 3 stuff, we need to make sure that tier 1 is able to support the users if they do have questions, so they don't need to always reach out to the Jamf admin. And that concludes our presentation on zero-touch provisioning. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you got a lot out of this video. If you have any questions about any of the workflows that we set up or how we got there, please reach out to me at chris@rocketman.tech. I'd love to discuss it with you further. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more macOS and Jamf Pro tips and tricks.